Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel, and it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. The last few episodes of Good Faith, we've been discussing the election and its specific aftermath. And I think it's time to start pulling back from the election itself and examine some bigger issues of how we make sense of the world. Because the election exposed how we are struggling to make sense of the world. Many people responded to the election results with some disbelief, like, how could the other side vote the way they did? Don't they know X, Y, or Z? And the answer is, well, the other side actually probably doesn't know X, Y, or Z. And the other side doesn't know that because X, Y, or Z isn't in their news feed. In fact, both sides increasingly distrust the news itself. The Gallup survey, which is one of the most reliable surveys about this topic, has shown a dramatic decline in American trust in news. Back in 1976, 72% of Americans said that they trusted mass news media. By 2023, that 72% had declined to 32%. News widespread has become almost a dirty word, a distrusted concept. And I believe that this decline in the trust in the very concept of reliable news matters for Christians. It matters beyond current day politics, which I want to move beyond, because the gospel depends on the idea that it is possible to get reliable news about the world. The gospel means literally good news. It means it is possible to get some news about the world, which the birth, death, and all the life in between and the resurrection of Jesus are meant to be about news in the world. They're things that actually happened in history and in the world. So the gospel depends on the idea it's possible to get reliable news about the world. And so if that belief that news is even possible declines, the gospel becomes more incomprehensible. Think about this analogy. Imagine if the concept of fatherhood became widely distrusted. Imagine if people believed, there's no such thing as real fathers. There's only fake fathers. You can't believe any father you see. What then would become of the Christian proclamation and prayer that God is our Father in heaven? See, we have a vested interest in the trustworthiness of human fathers so that they can image properly God, the true Father. So too, we have a vested interest in the trustworthiness of human news so that it can image the truly good news of God, the gospel of Jesus. And that's why I wanted to make sense of what is happening to news and how we, as individual Christians perhaps, can still rebuild this belief in the concept of news. And this guest for this discussion is John Ward, who's a perfect guest for this topic. John Ward has covered American politics and culture for 2 decades at the highest level, including being a White House correspondent who traveled aboard Air Force One. And he's perfect for this conversation because not only has he had deep experience at the highest level, he's also worked in media outlets on what you could say are both sides of the aisle. He's worked for the New Republic and the Washington Post, and also worked for Tucker Carlson's news startup. John is also a follower of Jesus, who is the author of Testimony, Inside the Evangelical Movement That Failed a Generation, a book that he came on Good Faith a while ago to discuss. Now, just for context for this conversation with John, we recorded this before the election. Now, here's my conversation with John. John, thank you for agreeing to do this and helping us make sense of this decline in trust. So thank you.
Good to be here, Curtis. Good to see you. I joked with you when we had a kind of initial conversation about this that I was Dick Cheneying myself.
It's really true. I first approached John to say, I'm coming up with this profile. Who would fit this profile? And he kept generously throwing various names. And at the end of that conversation, I was like, John, that he did Dick Cheney himself. That person is you. So here we go. All right, John, let's get into it. Let's step back and just from the perspective of somebody who cares about the world, what are the stakes involved in this massive decline of trust? What happens when we don't have commonly accepted sources of reliable news?
Yeah, I think if you follow that question all the way to its inevitable conclusion, a society can't really solve its problems peacefully without
Mm.
a set of mutually agreed upon pieces of information.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm even avoiding the term facts there because almost that term has become politicized.
Yeah.
But knowledge that is generally shared
Yeah.
and agreed upon, that's really the bedrock of a working uh, republic, a working democracy, because um, democracy, representative governments, they really depend on bargaining, negotiation, argument, debate, uh, and those things can't really happen if people are working from separate sets of facts
Yeah.
or assumptions, and so that leaves a vacuum where ultimately things kind of break down. We're not there at this point. We still have actually had quite a bit, despite the dysfunction in our government. We've had numerous examples of people working across partisan difference over the last several years to solve big problems, but the norm is not that, I would say. And so, if you continue to have that problem and if you continue to have multiple different sides point apart from each other's realities, that does leave a vacuum where people just decide at some point, enough with the talk.
Yeah. Right. So that, they no longer want to actually learn from the other side or actually work for a common solution where the facts, where the information, where the truth can support some compromise.
Or you just, the only way to solve problems is through coercion,
Yeah.
force, and even violence.
I think that's such an important point to make, that any enterprise in society that is about persuasion and not coercion, that is about actual conversation and compromise or conversion, even, and not simply winning by force of arms or force of state coercion of other means, that requires a trust in a source of truth making that the public agrees to, what we would call news. And so you've made just the case for why that's important if we want to care for the well functioning of society. But as you say that, John, I want to bring in the fact that you know the faith community so well, because it strikes me suddenly as you say that actually for Christians, for conservative Christians theologically who are evangelicals, let's call the other, that evangelicals should really care about trust in news, because the word evangelical comes from evangelion. It's the Greek word for news. That's actually what the word. It's good news, right? But it comes from the Greco-Roman days of what their version of mainstream media was, which was when people would go through towns to announce some great news that happened, like some great military victory that happened in a far off land. That was the evangelion. And so the gospel writers and the New Testament and the early church recognized, wait, we need something like that, some way of pronouncing news that everybody is going to at least listen to, and that the gospel kind of gets paired up with what in those days would have been called a secular culture of news. Like that's the gospel comes into that sort of broad secular understanding, like there is such a thing as news and we want to listen to it. And the gospel is going to be really, really good news. And that, so it strikes me that it's not just that, just for the functioning of society, well functioning and peaceful functioning society, that we as Christians should care about a well functioning news culture, but also like that basic news culture is one that the gospel, the evangelism, the proclamation of the gospel kind of is paired with, that we need a culture that actually is going to be open to proclamations and sharing of news. Does that make any sense as in terms of as somebody who is, who knows the faith community and knows the news community? It feels like that those two worlds have more been at odds when really they should be paired together in a much more sense of partnership.
Well, yeah, I mean, I like the way your brain works on these things. I think what it brings to mind for me is that the evangelical tradition is one of persuasion and
Yeah.
not one of coercion.
Yeah.
It does sort of base its appeal on the idea that um, others can be won to the faith through a demonstration, not just of facts, but of a lived experience, I think. But there are, truth claims
Yeah.
in the faith, absolutely. So I think it's more of just an animating spirit
Yeah.
that is at the core of the original evangelical instinct, which is to appeal to reason, to appeal to someone's uh, faculties, not just mental but also emotional and spiritual, in an attempt to win them over rather than to drive them before you.
So, if we work on the premise that we as Christians really ought to be invested in a public culture in which there is a thing called news that we can all at least listen to and give attention to and be potentially persuaded by, both for the sake of a peaceful society that can resolve and address its differences without use of coercion, and also so that we can get our own message out into the world and persuade people and be operating a culture that is open to persuasion on the basis of new news that you receive, something like the gospel. So if that's true, then it seems like it really behooves us as Christians to really understand how we got here. Like, why did this sort of trust in news crater so badly? John, what's your take? How do we understand what's happened here?
You mentioned the numbers from, I think you said the original data point was from 1976. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
The number that we're at now of people who trust in the mainstream press, 32%.
Yeah.
I don't have an exact number in front of me, but I would guess that that's a pretty good um, overlap
Yeah.
with the number of people who lean to the left in this country. And it's probably not a one-to-one count, but I think that in many ways this is a partisan problem, a polarization problem,
Mm.
where people who skew politically to the left would generally say they trust the mainstream media, and people who skew politically to the right uh, would say they do not. Now, that is an issue or a problem or a dynamic that's been at work for multiple decades, going back to at least the 1960s. We kind of had a post World War II moment in this country where both parties were um, pretty, similar in a lot of ways, pretty mainstream, and that pretty quickly fell apart by the 60s. And Barry Goldwater's campaign in 1964 for president, which he lost decisively to LBJ, was a campaign. I'm getting that right, right?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
That was a campaign in which you really saw for the first time, I think, some of these messages from the right that you can't trust the press, and that continued for to different degrees through the decades. The first presidential campaign I really covered closely was 2012. And one of the seminal moments that I remember from that campaign was Newt Gingrich on a campaign stage, who was confronted by Wolf Blitzer in South Carolina about having an open marriage. And Newt Gingrich just, completely went on offense against Wolf and CNN, attacking them for asking the question, demonizing the press. So that was all a prelude to the last decade or so. And before I kind of get into the last decade, I would just say there's plenty of evidence that the press does, in terms of who is in these jobs, does skew to the left, and that's probably not talked about enough. But it's also not a secret, and it's not like people deny it. I think people just sort of do minimize it or ignore it. But folks like Jake Tapper have openly acknowledged that polling data of people in the press does show that this is a thing. People in the media tend to skew to the left, so that does shape the coverage. Um, and then in the last, and we can talk more about that, but in the last decade, you had the explosion of smartphones. You had the explosion of social media. Social media companies really took control of the gatekeeping function away from mainstream press, to the degree that there are gatekeepers now. It largely is the social media companies and their algorithms, which are designed for engagement and amplification through what sort of makes people react
Yeah.
emotionally,
Yeah.
rather than maybe you could say that the old media establishment had an engagement or an amplification algorithm based on um, factors that were more up to them. I mean, and based on what they felt like was
Yeah.
newsworthy or important to the population or the country or the community.
Large percentages of mainstream medium did run liberal, and there's plenty of studies that show that evoked quite and that's a real problem, and that evoked a response, certainly from the right wing, to actually uh, have a right wing media that would be against mainstream media. And part of the narrative of the right wing media landscape was that you couldn't trust anything that mainstream media. So that seems like it got weaponized. And then
Yeah.
you're saying social media then just amplifies that, because social media is built to actually give people what they want to hear. And so it almost makes even more extreme that, hey, different parties, different tribes are going to just have their own news sources curated for them, and thus sort of evacuate the common space where we're hearing the same thing. Is that roughly what you're saying?
There were and are problems with the mainstream press,
Yeah.
but it's also been an issue that's been used for political gain by politicians on the right. Sometimes politicians on the left do this as well, but it doesn't really play into the pre-existing and long entrenched, sort of assumptions and biases of Democratic voters, like it does to Republican voters who have been told for decades the press is out to get you. And the press does skew to the left. So, but that issue has been, I would say, use the word weaponized, I would say often exaggerated
Mm.
by politicians who, the press is an easy punching bag and a natural punching bag, because they are the ones who often hold you accountable
Mm.
for your misdeeds, for your when you misspeak, and things like that. And so, rather than be held accountable, it's easy to say, well, actually, the people who are calling me out are to blame here, not me. And so that's been part of the issue. And when it comes to how it plays into this new environment of social media, and sort of anybody, I guess the other important thing here to mention here is that the means of distribution of information, uh, the means of distribution of publishing, which is
Mm.
different than just sort of speech. Publishing is amplifying speech to a mass audience, right? And the means of distribution to that used to be high. Used to need, access to satellites, expensive cameras, editing equipment, lots of staff. Now anybody can, run a TV show with, a few $1,000s worth of equipment and two or three people, and you can probably get it on Roku, you know, and show it on somebody's TV. But a lot of people are just watching on their computers and their phones. And so I think what has happened as a result of that is that much of the right said, well, we don't like what we're getting from the mainstream press. We're going to create our own channels. But there is not the same level of professionalism, and there is not the same culture of editing, fact checking, that there is in the mainstream press. Um, Again, I'm not saying the mainstream press is perfect, but they do have a culture of journalistic standards, and they fall short of them all the time, but they have them. And
Mm.
many institutions and outlets do pursue those standards, and that's a big difference with much of what you get from the right wing sort of new media echo chamber.
Well, so let's dive into this a little further, because I think you're providing a really important nuanced view. You're saying, look, there is a problem with bias, and mainstream medium is not perfect, and yet at the same time, institutionally, there are more safeguards there in place than there are in sort of outside that world. So help the average listener out here listeners, like how much can they trust and how much should they trust what they are reading in a New York Times, a CBS News broadcast? What at this point, how much should they actually put stock into that? And how much of the criticism and the reflexive distrust, how much of it is justified, how much of it should really be critiqued and challenged and be exposed as part of this weaponization or exaggeration of the flaws of mainstream media? How do we come to a more balanced view?
Well, I think one thing that people can think about, and I would submit to them that it's important to think about media holistically and not case by case, which gets to what I was just talking about in terms of sort of the culture of a media outlet, whether it's Newsmax, broadcast on the right versus CNN, or whether it's Steve Bannon's podcast and TV show on the right, or some other similar show, Sank, the New Turks on the left. What I'm really saying is that the mainstream press, they have a certain culture. Most places on the right do not. So if the only way to really see that, I think, is to think about media holistically and not case by case. Many times people get really upset about, a certain incident. You could go all the way back to Rathergate in the 2004 presidential campaign. In the 2024 presidential campaign, I was getting angry texts from a conservative friend of mine about, the media focusing on a comedian's comment at the Madison Square Garden rally over Puerto Rico and calling it an island of garbage. And he was angry that the media was focusing all about that. And then he felt like the media was trying to minimize President Biden's, comment about Trump supporters being garbage, and trying to, argue that he didn't actually say that. So, to the degree that that critique is accurate, and it's not probably worth getting into the ins and outs of it right this second. We can if you want. I'm happy to, but to the degree that it's accurate, like, I understand if you're conservative being upset by that. But it's really important to back up and to think about what are the standards here for information producing. And I think if you were to take the New York Times as an example of this, there's plenty of examples of the New York Times publishing things that are just sort of really tone deaf, and biased, on certain topics. But there's also just a wealth of information, really high quality information on the New York Times. So there's both, right? And I think my question about something like the Steve Bannon podcast is, how much really high quality information are you getting from that source, versus just sort of opinion that is, taking certain pieces of information that from other sources and then interpreting it for you. Now, is the New York Times interpreting information? Yes, but are they also going to sending reporters to all kinds of places all around the world and getting firsthand accounts of what happened there? Are they, paying an incredible amount of money for high quality polling data, stuff like that? Like, this is actually information that they are producing, not opinion, not interpretation. So I think you can look at the standards and you can look at the resources devoted to actually bearing witness firsthand, sending a person to a protest, sending a person to cover Congress who has actually been in the Capitol building for years and years and years and knows the players and knows how it works, has that expertise. That's journalism, and that's really valuable.
Yeah. Another word for when you say the word that you're encouraging our listeners to treat media holistically, another word for holistically is my favorite word, institutionally. That we actually have to think of news production and information gathering and distribution as an institutional exercise. There ought to be within us some, I mean, for lack of a better word, bias or leaning or giving of trust to more established institutions that have shown at least they have standards. Now, of course, part of why I think it's helpful and important for Christians to think theologically about institutions is because if we don't think of them as really human image bearers, then if we just think of them as tools, then once they make a mistake, we think of them as a defective tool that we just ought to chuck and throw out. And we don't think of them as human institutions, which are going to be fallible and which are going to make mistakes. And we ought to extend some grace to for the very fact that they're human. And so it almost seems to me like, yeah, we've got to get back to thinking about institutions of journalism, journalistic institutions, establishments as human image bearers full of flaws and yet also full of their God-given function in the world to bring about and produce news in a way that has a higher degree of trust and reliability. So, John, how do we get there so that we have this proper? It's a modified trust. It's in some ways we would trust any human being or human institution, in which, yeah, you want to grant some trust, you want to grant grace, but you're also going to be careful. You're also going to realize this other human being or human beings is fallible. How do we read the news and engage with the news with this kind of institutional lens that properly views this institution as a a collective human being?
Look, I come from, I have like firsthand experience of the conservative news world, because I spent 8 years at the Washington Times. It's actually a really interesting sort of path in the context of this conversation, because it was 8 years at the Washington Times.
Hey, just for not everybody may understand the sort of where the Times is in terms of the sort of political polarization. Give kind of a preview or an overview of where the Times sits in things.
Yeah, it was started in the 80s or 90s as a conservative counterpoint to the Washington Post. Yeah. It continues to publish today. The print edition is probably much smaller. It's online, but they still have a staff, and they have a building on New York Avenue on the outskirts of the city. And so I spent 8 years there. And then I went to work for Tucker Carlson at the Daily Caller, which was still conservative, but online only. And people actually should go watch Tucker Carlson's speech to the Conservative Action Political Conference in, I believe, the winter or spring of 2010, because he actually makes the case in that speech that you may not like the New York Times, but at least they spell people's names right. And he's defending the news gathering methods of the New York Times. And he actually was booed by the audience at CPAC, but he was making plans to start the Daily Caller, which was a website that would have a conservative point of view, but would try to gather information and gather news in a legitimate, responsible, rigorous manner. Now, I left the Daily Caller after about a year and a half, because about 6 months into that, it was clear that the financial pressures of needing to make money were causing the Daily Caller to take shortcuts on that more rigorous approach. It's a long game approach. You cannot become an established news player simply by hitting singles in the current news environment, because you have to scale to many, many numbers of clicks on your website. The only way to do that, unfortunately, at least at that point and probably today, is through sort of more outrageous content. And so, but I had those 8 years at the Washington Times, a conservative paper, where I was really schooled in the craft of, the blocking and tackling of gathering information and doing legitimate journalism. And the Times had its own problems, just like the mainstream media has its own problems and blind spots and biases. But it was a legit newsroom, and we did legit journalism, and it was a great training ground for me. So, you talk about having an institutional lens. You just I mentioned Steve Bannon's podcast earlier. They're actually sending, people on camera to stand outside of the Supreme Court for things and to stand outside of the Donald Trump trial for things. I mean, that's an attempt to appear to be, gathering news. Generally, those are, just sort of people saying opinions outside the court. But it's a nod in that direction. And as sort of provocative and outrageous and irresponsible as Steve Bannon often is, a lot of people unfortunately get their information from social media, which is about as irresponsible as you can be as a news consumer. You really should be getting your news from establishments that have editors, that have printed standards on their website, where you can check and see what is the process by which the information that I'm getting is produced. That's sort of the institutional lens.
John, I think it's so important and helpful that listeners recognize that you've worked in these sort of conservative news establishments, so that it doesn't. It seems to me that it doesn't have to be if you lean right, you are going to be an anti-institutionalist and going to be against any kind of news journalism that follows institutional standards. And then if you're on the left, you're willing to do that, right?
Like, so Curtis, institutions are inherently conservative because they build and preserve the good things that have come before us and build on those things. They conserve what is good, and they work to improve them, if they're working properly.
Yeah, that's such a great point. So what I want to talk next is I want to talk about just more, besides the partisan issue that I think has certainly obviously weaponized or accelerated sort of this decline in trust. I want to talk more about this institutional decline, because I think that, as we're saying, that's the long game here that we need to be invested in. So I want to talk more about what are the causes of this, the institutional causes of this decline, and what could be done about it. And we'll get to that conversation right after this. All right, we're back with John Ward, longtime veteran of various news institutions across the spectrum. And we're here to talk about a super important topic, which is how can we restore our trust in news media? And we've been talking about that there certainly has been one way in which the partisan warfare has weaponized how we view news sources and has just caused this overall decline. But I think there's also a longer term sort of dynamics in play, causing an institutional journalism to get weaker and weaker. And John, help us understand that. What are the, outside of politics, outside of the partisan warfare that wants to split everything in those categories, what are the long-term sort of dynamics that are afflicting actually both left and right institutions in journalism? Why is it getting so hard?
Well, I mean, it's harder to make money. And any business to stay afloat, obviously has to be profitable. During the days of print, it was, journalism was having salad days. I mean, they made a lot of money off of advertising in the print edition, classified ads, commercial ads. So subscriptions, you couldn't just go online and get stuff from people who were, taking it from Rolling Stone or the New York Times or National Review and kind of rehashing it on their website. So newspapers and TV stations, TV stations had a monopoly as well, and they made incredible amounts of money off of ad dollars, which you really only see now from major events like, the Super Bowl. Yeah. And so the internet really broke that up. It broke the monopoly on advertising. and classified ads went away, subscriptions went away, everybody put their content online for free. So that was a slow bleed for newspapers. I started at the Washington Times in 2001. That was already happening, and you're still continuing 20 plus years later to see, the sort of print world being pulled apart, and it's now hitting TV with pretty epic force as well. The top salaries for TV anchors, um, who are still on TV, you know, have been multi-million dollars. Hoda Kotb on the Today Show. I mean, I think she's leaving the show because they wouldn't pay her, upwards of $20 million. So um, the cap, I think, is going to be $1 million for a successful anchor on TV now, and I don't even know if that makes sense. The numbers of viewership it's all ebbing away towards YouTube influencers. So that's just really the bottom line. In the internet age, the way to get enough ad revenue is just to drive as much traffic as possible. It became a quantity game.
Yeah.
And a quantity game often leads towards, as I said before, outrage and sort of lowest common denominator information and, provocation. And it's expensive to go find things out. It's expensive to spend a long time digging into a story. It doesn't happen quickly, and so those things have fallen by the wayside, as well as local news. Local news has just been decimated by the same sort of financial factors, and so you have a lot of communities where there's not reliable information, and local governments not being held accountable.
That seems really problematic. If you don't have coverage of local news, how do you get people invested in local politics? And I do think that making this shift from this preoccupation with national politics and issues that frankly don't affect most people in where they live, and distracting them, or not just giving them information about the issues that actually touch them, it evacuates our ability to, as local communities, to actually come together to solve local problems, which is where most of the problems are that actually touch our daily lives. And that really does seem problematic. And here in San Jose, as our local newspapers, boy, they print a fraction of what they used to in terms of just what is happening in San Jose. And I think you're right. As a result, there's less accountability, there's less investment. So given all that, given that at the national level, we have a breakdown of the business model that makes news coverage more and more, have less resources for news coverage, even at the national level. And then especially that's getting pronounced at the local level because these newspapers aren't getting the ad revenue of local businesses that they used to, get to sustain local news coverage. Given all that, then, well, look, let's just, again, I'm from the perspective of a listener who's like, okay, well, I can't change the business model of a whole industry.
Right.
What do I do in this situation then if I still believe there is such a thing as news that I should learn about the world? How do I go about do that in this new environment?
At the national level, pick 3 to 5 print outlets that have the standards we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say no matter what your political persuasion is, try to pick 3 to 5 that are kind of across the spectrum. I would definitely throw the Associated Press into that mix. As of today, all of their content is free at apnews.org.
Mm.
And it's really, none of it is opinion. It's just all, fact-based reporting. They might have, some biases as well, but it's pretty solid, straightforward stuff. And from there, just sort of branch out, do, 2 of, the National Review on the right and one other, and the New York Times and one other on the left, and then supplement with 4 to 5 good Substacks that are doing opinion across the range of points of view. If you don't want to do that many, cut it in half. Do 2 or 3 on the fact gathering side and 2 or 3 on the opinion side. So that would be at the national level. At the local level, I would say look for places that are doing good work, that are trying to build a new business model. Austin, Texas, or maybe just Texas in general, has the Texas Tribune, which is a sort of a subscriber-based nonprofit model. The Baltimore Banner actually is another sort of rising publication here out in Maryland. And if you really care about local news, see if you can contribute to it yourself. There is a citizen publication of sorts that has now incorporated out in Hyattsville, Maryland, that I'm aware of. I'm sure there's lots of efforts like that. There's nonprofits that are trying to do this and help this problem at scale. So that's a way to contribute to that problem at the local level.
John, I want to explore some of this practical advice further, but start back with the reading from sort of trusted sources. Would you be willing to share with our audience, like, who's on your reading list, like, just so that they have some place to start?
Well, I mean, for national news, it's AP, New York Times, Politico. The Dispatch is very good. They're a good not right wing. They're conservative,
Yep.
news organization.
The original home of the Good Faith podcast. So shout out to them. Yeah.
Yeah. And there are a few others like that, but it's pretty straightforward. And then Substack is really where I get a lot of, first of all, I get a lot of my news through email newsletters, just because being in the news industry, I always subscribed to a lot of them. And, Axios is another one that's pretty easy and straightforward, pretty quick. And then Substack, the Liberal Patriot is a good one.
What do you think about the importance of paying for news?
Yeah.
Because it seems like if the business model is struggling here to produce good quality journalism, at least one thing we can do as citizens, as Christians, is to reward people and institutions that are producing good news. What do you think about that? Because it is tempting to just go to the free sources.
Yeah, no, I mean, we pay for the New York Times. We pay for, I pay for a bunch of Substacks.
Yeah.
And we also, donate tax-free gifts to, I think, at least 3 community radio stations. Now, I do that mostly for the music, to be quite honest. One's in Maine, one's in New York, and one's here in DC. But those community radio stations they're not news organizations by and large, but they're important, for their own reasons. But I do think it's important to support those kinds of places as much as possible.
All right, we've been talking with John Ward, longtime news veteran, about how to navigate this challenging landscape of getting news. And John's been making several very practical recommendations of established outlets that he would recommend feeding into our diet, not trusting entirely or wholly, but also not discounting, but placing the right amount of actual attention to. And then, John, you've also been talking about some other sources. You want to share more what you're digging up here from your own feed?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned Substack. It's a really great platform with a lot of good contributions. Wake Up to Politics by a guy who's in his early 20s. He just graduated college, Gabe Fleischer, but he does a really great job. And the thing that I really like about Gabe's newsletter is that he's doing high quality, a lot of analysis, but also a decent amount of reporting. And it's very much focused on solutions to our problems and not just talking about things that are wrong. So I highly recommend Wake Up to Politics.
John, one of the things that you've talked about is trying to distinguish between opinion and actual news information, news facts, right? Like you will. So it sounds like Substack, you're going to get a lot of great opinions.
Yeah.
Would you say, though, that for like, hey, what happened? What happened in Ukraine? What happened? What is happening in the economy right now? Would you steer more towards the established news institutions for that kind of information flow?
I would just answer your question with a question. Who has people on the ground? That's who you should be reading.
Right.
People who have actual physical human beings on the ground in Ukraine. You can have two people standing inside Congress,
Yeah.
And maybe they're both talking to members of Congress and to staff. But
Yeah.
you want to have people who are doing that, who are gathering information, and I would say attributing it as much as possible to known sources.
Mm.
I know that the media has made great use of anonymous sources for years. They do have their role, but for in an era where trust is low, I think the media has to really do as much as it can to name its sources.
Yeah. John, it strikes me that also, as I'm listening to you talk, I want to be looking for also other institutional markers of standards, practices, and resources. So you mentioned that you should check their journalistic standards, right? So and that's something that every journalistic institution should have available online, presumably. And if so, what are the things that we ought to be looking for when we're evaluating? Hey, should I give my attention to this particular news source?
Well, in addition to having people on the ground, I mean, you can have, you know, um, you can have Ricky Bobby go over to Ukraine and do some citizen journalism. But if there's no team of editors that are kind of
uh,
catching what he's throwing
yeah,
and then vetting it and contextualizing it,
yeah,
then that's another problem. So you need boots on the ground. You also need layers of managers and editors who can contextualize and edit and fact check the information that's coming. Is,
yeah.
does that sort of answer
I
the
think
question?
that's right. No, those are super helpful markers, and these are things that just you should be looking online when you're thinking, should I be subscribing to this newsletter? Yeah, and looking for markers like who are their editors, who are their fact checkers, where do they publish their
Yeah,
standards? I think those
and
are
most places publish their masthead.
yeah,
Most print publications who have these standards publish their masthead, which is the names of their editors, the names of their managers, so that you can actually go and see that.
yeah. John, what advice would you give for people in terms of kind of the volume, the total volume? I mean, we've been talking about having a little varied diet and a diet of people you trust, but what about just the sheer volume? How much of news
Yeah.
should people actually be consuming?
Yeah. Well, excuse me. You made the point a few minutes ago about moving away from an obsession with national news, and I think that's exactly right. I still do a weekly update or a weekly roundup of
Yeah,
what's happened nationally. But and I've begun to question, like, should I even do this? Does it contribute to the problem? But even in the very top of each of those roundups, and I think I've done 42 or 43 this year because there's one every Friday. I have a quote at the top of it that says, by spending concentrated limited excuse me, by spending concentrated limited time thinking about the big picture, we can devote more of our time to where, quote, agency and justice begin and end on the ground, bodily, in community, and real relationships in flesh and blood. And that's a quote from Karen Swallow Prior. And so I think, it's important to be an informed citizen. That's important to democracy. It's really quite vital. But we have to, it's easy to get stuck in like an endless scroll,
yeah,
not just literally, but, I can't tell you the amount of times I've sat down at my computer to try to do a discrete task, and 30 minutes or an hour later, I'm still
yeah,
sitting there, and my kids, I just missed an hour with my kids,
right,
and so I think that is really the crux of the issue. Like,
yeah,
we've got to be disciplined with how we use our time, not just to move from national news to local news, but to move from, being informed in a very strategic way
yeah,
to spending our time wisely. The other thing I would say about sort of bigger issues, and it could be actually local issues, it might actually
yeah.
be better to apply this to local issues, but like, pick an issue that you really want to get
Mm,
knowledgeable on. It could
yeah,
be a national issue. It's probably going to be more valuable if it's a local issue, and
right,
really become knowledgeable about that. And then take the attitude of a student to everything else, really. But try to use that knowledge that you're gaining on the one issue you want to become really expert at, and
Uh-huh.
then try to make a difference, advocate,
Yeah.
become a stakeholder, go go to your local city council, and start engaging those folks, organize a coalition, like really that can give people
Mm.
agency, I think.
John, it strikes me that there's almost a spectrum of how we can relate with to news, and forgive me for giving the standard former pastor's view of titling this with all the same letter. This is the old habits die hard here, but like, just think about the difference between a spectator, a student, and a servant. And it strikes me that you can engage with the news as a spectator, like it's a spectator sport, like
Yeah.
who's up, who's down, is my side winning, I'm so mad at the other side, you're cheering against or for it. And that obviously takes a special sort of passion in the partisan warfare, but that seems like the least useful use of our attention and energy to engage news as a spectator. You've brought up the idea of being a student, like actually, rather than trying to cheer about everything that's happening on the field, focus on something that you really care about, whether it's homelessness, it's the environment, it's small businesses or something like that, and go deeper rather than wider on a specific topic. I think that's moving in the direction of help. And what you just said there at the end is, then there's ways we can engage with news as a servant, like get the information that you need to actually serve people. And
Yeah.
this could be your local community, but it also could just be your family. Like, hey, what's my family dealing with? I've got learning issues with my child. I've got, my grandfather is having trouble with his insurance. Like, how do you actually start learning news starting from the perspective of who am I serving, and then what information, what news do I need to get to better serve those specific people? Yeah.
Well,
What do you think of that kind of framework?
I think it's a great framework. And I think that the more people actually make an attempt to become knowledgeable on an issue,
Yeah.
and then engage on that issue and actually make a difference,
Yeah.
I think that will drive home the point to a lot of people of how hard it is to do this, and
Mm.
how demanding it is to be a person in government or public service, in elected office. Um, it's really hard. Like I will tell you, I was on the parent teacher association at our kids' elementary school like two
Yeah.
years ago. I was the worst PTA member imaginable. I'm not cut out for that job, and it was really humbling. And when you make an attempt like that and then fall
Yeah.
flat on your face and actually like walk around the school like afraid, just ashamed that people are going to look at you and be like, they know how bad I was, like that gives you a sense that like, wow, I should probably be moderate in my complaints and my criticism. Because somebody said to me very memorably recently, like these things don't run themselves. Like people have to
Right.
run them. The other thing I
Yeah.
want to say is on the spectator point. I love that point. I have a great quote on this. Sam Harris, who has I can't remember the name of his podcast, but he's famous author, one of the former militant atheist guys. He was on Andrew Sullivan's podcast recently. He said this. He said, "We have culturally performed some kind of psychological experiment on ourselves where our relationship to media, our relationship to information, our relationship to fame and celebrity has turned many of us into spectators who
Mm.
watch reality as though it were the first act of a movie, which we hope is going to be good. So the stakes, no one feels in their gut that they're part of the stream of history, where things could really become unrecognizable and unrecognizably wrong with us as a democracy." It's quite profound.
Wow. Yeah. And that, what you're saying says, like, if we can move more into the servant role where we're consuming news so that we can actually do something in our lives with the people that we actually can touch and see. I love your story about the PTA because I have this exact same experience where when we do that, it actually produces a natural humility. Hopefully, at least if the Spirit of God is at all present and working in us, a spirit of humility and grace and mercy to those who are also trying to make a difference in the world. That somehow, when you, rather than from a spectator outside watching somebody else's story, but actually enter in and try to become part of the story, you actually have just much more empathy and connection and grace to extend to other people who are in that same story as you, and recognize how messy it is and how hard it is. I love that, John. That certainly has been my experience. I haven't had the PTA version of that, but I've had numerous other versions of that. John, this has been great. Any final word of encouragement that you'd want to give to our listeners in terms of their news habits, their news practices?
I would just say, read read more fiction,
Mm,
and take in addition to the stuff we've talked about as it relates to becoming a servant and engaging, and trying to go deep on something and serve your community or serve the country for that matter on an
yeah.
issue. I think another really important paradigm is to make room for the arts, and to make room for beauty, and also try to spend part of your week every week creating something.
Huh.
That could be a wide range of things. I have a friend who creates moments for people, just through the way that he interacts with them. But it's
Yeah.
important to think of ourselves as creators and to
Huh.
think intentionally about how are we creating, how are we not just engaging in and consuming beauty and the arts, but how are we, every time that I went to a beautiful concert at the Kennedy Center with Ify O'Donovan and Bonnie Light Horseman, and they were backed by the National Symphony Orchestra. It's a real gift to be in a city like Washington and have those
Yeah.
opportunities. But every time that I encounter, the arts in a way that just inspires and brings me to tears, it increases my desire to give that same gift to other people and to create things that create a similar experience for others. And I may never get there, in terms of doing what my favorite musicians do, but I can at least move that direction.
John, that is a beautiful word. It is not one that I would normally expect from somebody who is a news veteran to say, maybe you should read less news and listen to more music and watch more art and actually maybe even create more beauty. But something about that resonates as incredibly insightful and true. So, John, thanks so much for this great conversation.
Curtis, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
And listeners, we will once again next week be trying to make sense of this world as we gather around the campfire.